title of the program is Israel, the Startup Nation, and our guest today is Sally Abrams. And talking with Sally a little bit earlier in the week, she's going to tweak this program a little bit, presentation, to maybe talk a little bit about the startup, because that's an interesting topic, but also maybe divide it out because there is some interesting activity over there in Gaza and that, and she wants to maybe talk a little bit about that and thought that might be of interest. So she'll kind of split her program into a couple of different segments. A little biography on Sally. Sally's a lifelong resident of Minnesota. She's a graduate of the University of Minnesota. She co-directs the Speakers Bureau for Jewish Community Relation Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas, and has spoken about Israel and or Judaism in scores of churches, classrooms, and civic groups. Ms. Abrams is passionate about creating understanding of this complex part of the world and building bridges between the Jewish and non-Jewish communities. A fluent Hebrew speaker, Sally also teaches Hebrew as part of the University of Minnesota's College in the Schools program, held at the Talmud Torah of Minneapolis. She writes a blog on Israel for TC Jewfolk and Times of Israel websites, and is also planning her next trip to Israel. Sally's married to Mike Abrams. Her family includes 7 children, 4 by birth, 3 by marriage, and get this, 2 perfect grandchildren. Warm welcome for Sally.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for inviting me to speak at a time when the news is relentless. When this date was set back in... When this date was set back in May, I was in conversation with Andrea and suggested, do you want to know about what makes Israel the startup nation? How did it get that name and why? And she thought that would be a great topic of interest to business people here. And last week I contacted her and I said, it would seem tone deaf if I don't address current events at all. So I'm going to do a little bit of both. But I am going to start with the topic of startup nation, of why is Israel second only to the United States in the number of startup companies it has. This book came out a few years ago. It's really an interesting read about what factors in Israeli culture and society have created a place where there is so much innovation. Just to give you some framework, Israel has less than 1,000th of the world's population. About 7 million people live in Israel, but it is third, only behind the US and China, in the number of companies that are traded on the NASDAQ. So that is quite an unusual thing, and second in the terms of the number of startups. And so why is that? Just the list of technology that's part of our everyday life that had its origins in Israel will astonish you, including the Centrino chip that's part of laptops, text messaging technology, cardiac stents, a huge number of technological, biomedical innovations that are part of everyday life worldwide had their origins there. And the Iron Dome technology, which I'll come back to later in this presentation, the technology that enables guided removal of missiles from the sky, which is something the United States and Israel partnered on, also comes from there. This particular professor, Professor Tal Ben Shahar, was the most popular professor at Harvard University for many years. He's Israeli, and he taught courses on happiness. And after 14 or so years at Harvard, he went back to Israel, decided to go home, and he created a documentary dealing with the same questions that the book Startup Nation deals with. What are the factors that have enabled Israel to be so innovative? And so I am lifting material from this wonderful documentary, Israel Inside, because I could not come up with a better framework than the one that he did to describe it. Why is it, he asked, that Israel is leading in innovation and leading the world in its innovation-based economy, and why is Israel a laboratory for problem solving?
And he came up with a very interesting framework, something he called actualizers, factors that enable a person or a place to reach their full potential. What are Israel's actualizers? And he named 6 of them, and I'll talk a little bit about each one and what makes them unique in Israel. Family, adversity to advantage, the word chutzpah, which means sort of gutsy nerviness. It's a Yiddish word. It's very much associated with Israelis who often are perceived as having a kind of aggressive, take no prisoners, don't take no for an answer persona. Education, taking action, and the Hebrew term tikkun olam, which means repairing the world. He feels that these actualizers are what explain why Israel is such a center for innovation. And he starts with family. It's not that family is unique to Israel. I think family is central to every culture, but what he describes is the primary role of family and how child-centered Israel's culture is. And you will notice this if you live in Israel with children, or even if you just vacation there with children. You will get more unsolicited parenting advice from complete strangers. Doesn't your child need a hat? Why didn't you put sunscreen on? People will just because they feel sort of a collective ownership of everybody's kids, and they'll just butt right in and tell you what they think. So that kind of investment breeds, in his view, breeds confidence and a certain kind of resilience that enables people to get out there and try new things. And this picture happens to be me and our Israeli family that was taken last fall. I'm in Israel every year for sure, often twice, and I am always planning my next trip, which will take place in October. Adversity to advantage. He describes a crucible being something that pushes you to your limits and beyond, and being able to bounce back from it. And certainly Jewish history affords us many examples of crucibles. The Holocaust comes to mind, centuries of persecution and being forced to relocate. But the establishment of the State of Israel and just building it from the ground up, that was a crucible too. And the early pioneers had to figure out how to build an economy in a place that had no natural resources, not enough water, no oil. You know, people joke, like, if God was leading Moses all through the promise, you know, like all through the desert, why couldn't he have had him land somewhere that had a little bit of oil? But that's the way it is. You know, that's the way it is. So how do you create an economy when you don't have natural resources? That is a crucible. That pushed the early pioneers to their limits. Okay. One of the quotes that I love from this documentary was one of the high-tech innovators reflected on this, how do you build an economy when you don't have the obvious natural resources. And she said, you can sit, you can cry and die, or you can put together strong teams that are problem solvers. And those became the new pioneers, the innovation pioneers. Here's an example. Israel has a harsh climate. It's a desert. And agriculture is not, you know, it's not like agriculture in Minnesota where we have 10,000 lakes and endless amounts of rain and sometimes too much. When my Israeli relatives come here, no matter how many times they come, they cannot get over the water. And no matter where we go, one of them always is saying, no matter what, just, there's the Mississippi again. Doesn't matter if it's a lake or what. It's like they cannot get over the water. But Israel doesn't have much rainfall. It doesn't have much water. And they had to come up with innovative ways to grow stuff in a dry place. And so the concept of drip irrigation originated in Israel. Netafim and their motto is doing more with less. And this technology not only benefits Israel, but they've taken it to every corner of the world where people are farming without much rain. Okay. Immigration is another crucible, because so many of the people who live in Israel have come from another place. You had 1 million Soviet Jews come in the 1990s. You had thousands of black Jews from Ethiopia come in the 1980s and early 90s. Right now, you have Jews leaving France in droves because it's become so awful for them there. And so they are heading to Israel. You have Jews who are fleeing persecution. You have Jews that have come there by choice. And this particular airplane, it says nefesh b'nefesh. It means soul to soul. This is a plane load of American Jews who aren't fleeing, they're leaving actually a much probably easier life, and who are coming to Israel to start their life, to join into the Jewish project. And so immigration societies, well, Israel is like America in that. We have an immigrant society. And immigrant societies tend to be very dynamic because of what people bring to them. And the fact that in an immigrant society you have people who are choosing to join on to your endeavor, that's different than just being born somewhere and that's where you are. To get up and leave a place and join another, it's a big move, and people bring something special to that. I mentioned in the beginning chutzpah. You can be a negative, or you can look at it as challenging the status quo, turning no into yes. And Israelis are expert at that. When someone says it can't be done, they will try to figure out a way that, yes, it can be done. And that persistence, that perseverance, enables them to solve difficult problems. I think most people know that overall Jews as a culture place such a huge value on education. Even during World War II, when Jews were confined to ghettos, one of the first things that they would do, even under those conditions, is create schools so that children were learning. But it's not only the value of education, there's a Jewish style or approach to learning, which is very dynamic. It's to ask a lot of questions, to challenge everything, to be open to multiple answers, to be engaged in dialectic, in a vigorous and dynamic discussion in which everybody has a say, and which doesn't accept, that turns everything over to look at the other side. And when you have people educated in that approach, then they take that to the concept of solving problems. Okay. That is the antecedent to innovation, to have an educational approach that really pushes asking and answering questions and not taking no for an answer. Taking an idea and putting it out into the world, not waiting for someone else to do it. That is very much an Israeli value. We will do it, and maybe others will follow, but we will take the idea and put it into action. And we're not worried. They're not worried about failure. In the United States, if you start something up and you fail, there's a lot of shame attached to it. And it's like you're finished. But in Israel, it's just not the way it is. They don't look at failure as a stumbling block. It's a stepping stone to the next project. It's something you learn from. There's not stigma attached to it. It's just you move on, and you take something from it. Tikkun olam is a central Jewish value that we are God's partners in repairing the world. And Israelis see that as part of their national mission. That the country wasn't established only to be a nation, a national place like other nations, but with a special mission in the world to help. We can look at Jewish texts. The Rabbi Hillel, who lived more or less at the same time as Jesus, said, and in Hebrew it's im ein ani li mili, if I am not for myself, who am I? But if I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? Im lo achshav imatai. Every Jew knows that expression. If not now, when? In other words, don't wait to start up the change that you think needs to happen. And that drives this sense of obligation that Israelis have to be helpful in the world. Just a few examples that I'm going to give you are, they're usually the first on the scene, if they're allowed in, to any disaster site. To a tsunami, to an earthquake. They set up the first field hospital in Haiti after the hurricane a couple of years ago. The first babies that were born there, the mothers were naming the baby boys Israel because they were so grateful that someone came to their aid. Another, I think, very interesting example that I can give you is this one. And I want to let it sink in for a moment. There are 325 or so Arabs in the Arab world, but there is only one place that has a bone marrow registry for Arabs, and that's Israel. If an Arab who lives in Saudi Arabia or Morocco or the Gulf states needs a bone marrow transplant and can't find a match within his own family, and the families are big, so oftentimes they can find a match, but if they can't, where can they turn? The only Arab bone marrow registry is in the state of Israel that has about 1 million Arabs. These two doctors are the ones that run it. The doctor on the right is a Jewish Israeli, the doctor on the left is an Arab Israeli, and particularly the doctor on the left was the one that went out into the Arab Israeli communities to explain how does bone marrow transplantation work and why it's so important for Arabs to be represented. Because if a match can't be found, it's not because of racism, it's because they're underrepresented in the pool. And once she explains that, people come, the bone marrow drives are, they're oversold, people come forward in large numbers. The picture on the right is a little Arab Israeli boy who received bone marrow, and the man holding him was his donor, and the woman on the right is his mother. This to me is a very powerful example of Israel taking charge, im lo achshav imatai, if not now, when, of taking charge of trying to solve a problem and filling in a very significant gap in the world. So how do we talk about the horrible summer of 2014? And it's been a horrible summer as far as this region of the world is concerned and the news. Horrible. I cannot remember a time when I was so personally affected by the news, where I finally had to take my iPhone out of my bedroom and charge it in the kitchen at night, because I would wake up every 2 hours during the night to check what was happening. And that's insane, I had to stop doing that. But I could only do it by taking the phone out of the bedroom, where I could not stop checking what's happening. The kidnap and murder of 3 Israeli teenagers and the revenge murder of an Arab Israeli, these horrific crimes, already seem like ancient history, but they were 6 weeks ago. How do we talk about this? I'm very happy to have a chance to start talking about this, but I will tell you that those of us in the Jewish community and in my organization, we are in the midst of processing this ourselves. And I cannot come to you today with some slick, prepared thing, because we are still in the midst of sorting this out, and I think we will be for some time. The news is constant, relentless, and the facts, sometimes the news stories get ahead of the facts as well, and the facts take a while to come out. An example would be the casualty counts in Gaza. The initial numbers come out, they're put out by the Hamas, they're put out by the UN, and then little by little they have to be verified, and that takes weeks, and often, even I think the BBC reported today, there's questions now about the accuracy of those counts and how many were innocent civilians and so forth. So I'm saying this as a caveat that we only know today what we know, and it's going to take a while to sort out what really happened. I know this, that thousands of rockets have been fired into Israel. There's a ceasefire now that started at midnight last night, and so far it's holding. I've got the red alert on my phone so I can see every time a rocket comes over. And there are negotiating teams in Egypt to work on this. The rockets that have been fired from Gaza have the ability to pretty much, this is new. In the past, the rockets did not have the ability to reach all the way to Tel Aviv, and certainly not to Jerusalem, and certainly not as far north as Haifa, but they do now. This is also a factor. This is just one of many horrible pictures from Gaza of destruction and loss and casualties. And these are horrible images, and a lot of suffering has taken place and will continue till this is, till Gaza is rebuilt. A lot of lives have been lost. There's no but that comes after that. That's a full stop. It's a very difficult to fight. The difficulty in this war was the asymmetry of where the rockets were coming from and how many of them were coming from civilian facilities. The tunnels, not only were the rockets a threat and continue to be a threat, the Iron Dome can take them down most of the time, but they don't get all of them. And no population, I mean, how can you possibly live under constant rocket fire where you have to keep going into a bomb shelter? I mean, that's not a strategy for long-term survival either. Plus, every time the Iron Dome is deployed, it costs $55,000. That's not sustainable in the long term either. But the threat of the rockets is one thing, and these tunnels that were discovered is another. Now, there's conflicting reports of how much did the Israeli government know about these tunnels? Did they know the extent of them? I'm reading conflicting accounts of how much they knew. But this is one thing that was revealed in this operation, is the complexity and the extent of the tunnels and how many of them go from Gaza under Israel's border and come up under cities in Israel, under the kibbutzim, the collective farms, up under homes and neighborhoods. What was the plan? The plan was to launch a surprise attack on Rosh Hashanah, on the Jewish New Year, where hundreds of Hamas fighters were going to come out of these tunnels, kill as many Jews as they could, and kidnap others and take them back into the tunnel system, knowing that the Israelis wouldn't destroy the tunnels if Israeli civilians were trapped in there. And this, I can't let my mind go too far into what would have happened if such an attack had been launched. But this is, I just got done talking with you about, what you can build, what Israel does build, what it has built. And the people who live in Gaza have no less talent and ability than Israelis. But the Hamas that is in charge of Gaza has harnessed it for this. The cement, the resources, the manpower, the energy, the intellect that could have built something good for the people that live there was all poured into this underground city whose objective is to terrorize Israel. I don't know of a situation in war where of the two warring parties, one side continues to provide for the civilians of the side that they're fighting. But you should know that Israel continues to provide supplies to the people of Gaza, because the war isn't with the people of Gaza, it's with the Hamas. It's not Israel against the Palestinians, it's Israel against the Hamas. And so when I see on Twitter and on Facebook, Free Gaza, I want to add, just change your hashtag. It should be Free Gaza from Hamas. Free the people from this totalitarian, jihadi government. And then the last thing, I'm going to mention two more things and then take questions. This is also of very great concern to me, and it should be to everyone, and that is the unprecedented rise now in anti-Semitism, that as a result of this war you're seeing not people who legitimately criticize Israel, which there's no problem in doing it, and people do, Israelis do. All you have to do is look at the Israeli press. It's all in English, and you will see very harsh criticism of Israelis, on all sorts of policies that Israel takes. It's the demonization and the hatred of Jews, particularly at the protests that take place in Europe. I was at several protests in Chicago over the last couple of weeks, and while the counter-protests by people sympathetic to the Palestinian cause were harsh, they did not, at least not yet, cross over into this territory. But you're seeing this all over Europe, particularly in France. And here's an example of a story that was coming from Germany. And this kind of sentiment, this kind of feeling, is very frightening, where it can go. The other thing that's frightening and should be of concern to people in this room is the fact that the rockets one of the rockets landed close enough to Ben Gurion International Airport that our own government, our own FAA, stopped flying there for about 36 hours, and the European airlines all followed suit. And if you think that's just a problem for an airport in Israel, then I would say to you in Hebrew, Boker Tov, good morning. It is not. Because any jihadi group that wants to shut down an international airport and has the support and the wherewithal and the rocketry to do it, can do it. And this, you know, it's not only that the rocket can take a plane down, but if the FAA or other government bodies are afraid enough that it could happen, it shuts down air travel. And that's a tremendous tool in the arsenal of the jihadis to be able to shut down international air travel. So I wish I could end on a happy note, because I sure started on one, and talking about what makes Israel an innovative place is a happy story, and this is not a happy story. It'll take a while till we have a sense of where things are going. One significant and important outcome is this strategic alliance that is emerging between the more moderate Arab states and Israel. I'm going to stop now to take questions. I'll conclude at 1:30 for sure, but I'll stick around after that for anybody who wants to ask. Yes?
I believe that the U.S. is the largest provider of aid to
Yes.
Israel.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you know what that amount is, and who's next? What other countries kind of stack up?
The aid to Israel is in a couple of $2 billion a year, and most of it is grants with which they spend the money to buy military armaments and hardware, which comes back to the United States. The military equipment and hardware is purchased from the United States, so in a sense, I mean, it's providing jobs to Americans that are working in the places where these things are produced. Second behind that is, I believe, Egypt. And that has held, I don't want to quote the wrong number, but I know they're second behind Israel in terms of aid, and that has been since the peace treaty in 1979. Other questions? You can ask me anything. You don't have to worry that they'll scare me off. It's okay.
Where does Hamas get the majority of their funding?
Well, that's part of the reason why this war is happening, because they were in the squeeze. They used to get a lot of their money by having underground tunnels that went from the Sinai into Gaza that were running through Egyptian territory, and they were smuggling in all kinds of goods that they would sell to the people in Gaza. And from that was a big, you know, they weren't opening like a Walmart. They were doing it all like by these underground tunnels, and that was where a lot of their money was coming from. And then the Egyptians absolutely shut those tunnels down because they are concerned, equally concerned, about the threat of the Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. So that squeezed them from one end and dried up a lot of their funding. And, you know, the Qataris that support them were not able to get money easily to them. And so part of the reason, at least experts think they launched this war, is because if they could keep lobbing rockets into Israel, knowing they can't really take Israel down, but they can make life hell there, that eventually they'll have to enter into some sort of negotiations where Israel will make concessions that they want, like opening a port or an airport or lifting the blockade of goods, because the goods have to be checked before they can come in so that they don't ship weapons. But even the blockade is obviously not entirely effective either. So they're under a financial squeeze right now, and that was one of the reasons why they launched this war. Yes?
I was fortunate in spending some time in Israel a couple of years ago, and just looking long term, not at the short term problem. And what I think it was a bit of a study group, and one of the concerns that was really expressed both by Israelis and Arabs that we met with was the role of the ultra-Orthodox Jews in government and the problem that they played in kind of evolving what the future of Israel would be. Because ultra-Orthodox, at least up until recently, didn't have to serve in the military. They were out reproducing most of the other segments of society, so that now maybe as approaching 50% of the children entering into the school system are coming from ultra-Orthodox families.
I don't think the percentage is that high, but the overall trend and the concern you describe is legitimate. He's describing, you know, the very Orthodox religious Jews in Israel who, by mutual agreement in the early years of the state, didn't serve in the military. David Ben-Gurion really thought if he made that kind of an agreement, it wouldn't matter because they were going to just sort of wither away, and, you know, but they didn't. I mean, they are a percentage of the population, and it is an internal Israeli issue that is garnering attention and needs it, but right now all the attention is focused elsewhere. It's significant because thinking long term is, and the mandatory conscription, that piece is beginning to change. The parliament has enacted some legislation to begin to shift that mentality of no, everybody serves, you know, and to begin to remove that sense of the ultra-Orthodox, you know, being a burden on society, that they would carry their fair share of the weight.
The middle-class family that we dealt with,
they're very frustrated by that.
they really started, they were resenting the fact that they were carrying so much of the burden.
Yes.
And I think a lot of the thought was, and not expressed very well sometimes, was that the ultra-Orthodox crazies, quotation marks, were just as difficult to deal with as any of the Islamic crazies, and that how could you ever reach any kind of conclusion if you keep sinking to the lowest common denominator in both societies. And a lot of folks were very discouraged. And this was at a good time. This was 4 years ago.
I think the issue of Israel's own fundamentalists, its own crazies, you know, as exemplified by the revenge murder of this Arab-Israeli child, this is something that Israel must deal with, and I think as soon as things quiet down and the attention is turning outward, can be turned back inward, it will have to be dealt with. There is no other way. It has to be dealt with. Every society has its bad, lawless element. The question isn't whether you have it, it's what does the rest of the society do about it? Other questions? Is that, are we at 1:30? I'll stick around, absolutely. Thank you.